Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about microbial weathering. Specifically, we'll be talking about mineral dissolution and how microbes can affect this process. And this topic is really important for things like silicate and carbonate weathering and soil formation, which are all really important topics for understanding climate and climate feedbacks that are really important today especially. And so we'll be talking about these things over here on the left today. But unfortunately, we can't fit everything that falls under microbial weathering in this video. So we do have a part 2 coming up in which we'll talk about sulfide oxidation as well as microbial corrosion, which is a really important topic as well. But again, in this video, we're going to be focusing on these topics over here to the left. And like it says in the thumbnail, we'll get to how these things, especially silicate weathering, is important for global climate, especially the current climate change trend. So first, let's go over a little bit about mineral surface reactivity and how that affects mineral weathering rates, or more specifically, mineral dissolution rates. So chemical weathering rates, which first of all, chemical weathering is a little different than physical weathering. So physical weathering, which we'll talk about in a few slides, is more of the physical breakdown of rocks because of more physical processes, such as plants' roots thriving into rock fragments in the bedrock of soil and breaking it apart physically. But chemical weathering requires some sort of fluid flowing through the rock or interacts with the rock in some way and alters it depending on the rock's composition, the rock's morphology, the texture of the rock, as well as the geochemistry of the fluid. And so these are the factors that control the rates of chemical weathering. But if we look at this on a closer or more zoomed in level, when we're actually talking about the atoms and the molecules making up the crystal lattice that makes up the mineral in the rock, then we can see that whether the mineral dissolves is really a fight between the strength of bonds in the crystal structure as well as the hydration energy of the ions at the surface of the mineral. So what does this mean? Well, the strength of the bonds in the crystal lattice is pretty straightforward. It's just how strong the bonds are that are holding the crystal or mineral together. Whereas the hydration energy of ions at the surface of the mineral is referring to the amount of energy released when ions undergo hydration. So water molecules, which are obviously in the solution that surrounds the surface of the mineral, are polar molecules, or the oxygen has a partial negative charge, whereas the hydrogens have a partial positive charge. So these oxygens in the water molecules are going to be attracted to the positive ions or the cations at the surface of whatever mineral that the solution is flowing near or on. And the hydrogen side of the water molecule is going to be attracted to the anions or the negative ions at that mineral surface. And so if these ions at the mineral surface have a high hydration energy, aka a lot of energy is released when they become hydrated or surrounded with water molecules and dissolved into the solution, that means that the mineral is likely going to dissolve into the solution. So things like sodium chloride, salt, dissolves in water for exactly this reason. The hydration energy of these ions is greater than the strength of the bonds within the mineral that are holding them together. If things were the other way around, or for example, you had a mineral where the strength of the bonds was much stronger than the hydration energy of the ions, then that mineral would be relatively insoluble. However, even if it's favorable for that mineral to dissolve, such as in the case for sodium chloride, a number of steps are involved with the dissolution of an atom or molecule from the surface of a mineral. So it takes a little bit of work to actually get that atom or molecule to release from the surface of the mineral and become dissolved in the solution. And so these steps include transport of the reactants through the solution to the mineral, as shown here at the bottom, and then adsorption of the reactants to the mineral surface. So they have to adsorb to the surface. Remember, adsorption is something going on or being absorbed to a surface, whereas absorption with a B is something being taken into another thing. But we're talking about the surface of minerals here, so we're talking adsorption. So adsorption has to occur. Then 3, the migration of the reactants to an active site on the mineral surface has to occur. 4, the actual chemical reaction between the adsorbed reactant and the mineral has to occur, which also may include additional steps. And after this reaction has occurred to create the product, the migration of the newly hydrated ions away from the reaction site and desorption from the mineral has to occur. So coming off of the surface of the mineral and then transport of the products away from the mineral surface and into the bulk solution. Now, this last step may seem trivial, but it's really, really important for the continual dissolution of the mineral. How so? Well, if the products or the hydrated ions don't go that far away from the mineral in the bulk solution and they just kind of surround the mineral there, then the saturation states of those ions in solution are going to be so high that the rest of the mineral will not be able to dissolve. And this is also why if you sprinkle a bunch of salt into water and expect it to dissolve right away, if you have really big clumps of the salt, you're going to have to try and break those up to help the dissolution of that mineral into your water solution, because if you're not going to break those up, the dissolution of that mineral is going to stop after those surface ions are detached, and then going to have a hard time dissolving the rest of that inner part of that clump because it needs to transport those ions away as an extra step. Whereas if you had all the grains dispersed evenly and they were more fine rather than clumps, then dissolution is going to occur more quickly. And again, that doesn't take away any of these steps, but it increases the rate at which the steps occur. But other than breaking up clumps of salt in your solution, how else can we control the rate of these mineral dissolution steps? So these 5 variables are the most important variables when it comes to what controls the rate of these steps. First, the structure of the crystal lattice. This is important because, for example, if you have a silicate mineral such as feldspar, these have silica tetrahedra that are cross-linked, so their crystal structure is already pretty hard to dissolve because of just the way it's structured. In addition, the composition of feldspar, for example, has both silica tetrahedra and some tetrahedra that contain aluminum rather than silicon. The aluminum tetrahedra, or the aluminum atoms in particular, are more easily dissolved than the silicon atoms or silica tetrahedra. And so chemically, the aluminum sites in feldspar are susceptible to dissolution. However, once the aluminum sites at the surface of the mineral have been dissolved and released into solution, the rest of the aluminum sites are harder to get to because of how the crystal lattice is structured in a way that cross-links the silica tetrahedra to protect the inner aluminum sites, if that makes sense. So the way that the crystal lattice is structured has a strong role at the rate of dissolution of minerals. But moving to this second rate controlling factor, this is the orientation of the crystal structure. The coordination number, or how many atoms a particular atom is bonded to, does help to protect it if it's higher from dissolution rather than if it's lower, which makes it more susceptible to dissolution. Now, what does this mean? Well, if you remember from the crystal structures video, I'll link it up here if you want to check it out. Coordination number is basically the number of closest neighbors. Remember that CN, or coordination number, also stands for closest neighbors. That's a trick I taught you guys in that video. So if you remember that, you can see that the silica tetrahedra in this silica mineral here has 4 closest neighbors, and they are the oxygen atoms in the silicon oxygen silica tetrahedra. However, the ones at the edge or the outer surface of the mineral are not coordinated by all the oxygens. In fact, the one up here only has 1 closest neighbor. It's way more susceptible to dissolution rather than the ones within the center of the structure that are coordinated by 4 different atoms. And so the orientation of the crystal surface is really kind of referring to how susceptible are your atoms at the surface, how coordinated are they. The third main rate controlling factor is the defects on the crystal surface. We also talk about defects in crystal lattices in that crystal structures video I just mentioned. And this is referring to things like steps in the crystal structure at the surface where the sheets of atoms kind of stop and there's a step downward to the next sheet of atoms. And then you can also have kinks, which are kind of like corners or triple junction things. And kink sites and steps are favorable for dissolution because they have lower coordination. The fourth rate controlling factor is adsorbed molecules or ions. Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier, referring mostly to water adsorbing to the mineral, but other molecules and ions can also absorb to the mineral's surface depending on the reactivity of its surface, because obviously minerals have reactive surfaces. And so if you have ions in solution, for example, sodium and chloride, if they're already already in the solution that you're trying to dissolve it in, and you have a sodium chloride crystal here, then maybe the sodium will be like, hey, look, there's a chloride ion at the surface of that mineral, and the chloride ion will be like, hey, look, there's a sodium ion with a plus charge that I want, and those positive cations will go attack those anions or adsorb to those surfaces where there's anions, and the anions or negative ions in solution will absorb to the surfaces where there's cations. And so this attack or absorption of these ions to the surface of this mineral will close off the absorption sites for reactants that will dissolve the mineral, like water or hydrogen ions, which is something we'll get to. But any ions in solution, even if they're different than the mineral we're talking about, this is an example where they're the same, but even if they're different and they're just attracted to that mineral surface, they could slow the rate of chemical weathering. However, there are ions in solution that increase the rate of chemical weathering by adsorbing to the mineral surface, or reacting rather with the mineral surface. And these are included in the reduction oxidation factor in controlling the rate of chemical weathering. So how does reduction and oxidation work, and how does it control chemical weathering rates? Well, atoms in a mineral have a certain oxidation state or charge that can be changed or reduced or oxidized depending on how many electrons they have or give up or are given, etc. So what do I mean by this? Well, here's an example here in the middle showing a manganese oxide mineral with all these manganese oxidation state 4 atoms, which are the ones that like to stay in the mineral in the solid phase. And then you have the reduction of manganese +4 to manganese +3 because of this addition of the electron, making it one more negative charge, bringing it down from 4 to 3. This reduction causes dissolution of the manganese oxide. Why? Because manganese 3 likes to be dissolved in solution, whereas manganese 4 likes to be solid. And there's actually a word for this, and it's called reductive dissolution. Now, there are actually minerals that go the opposite direction, where they want to be reduced to be solid, and if you oxidize them, they dissolve. And so the question here is, what's bringing over that electron? Or in the case of oxidative dissolution, what would be taking away that electron? And that depends on electron donors and acceptors that are in the solution, which can be a whole range of ions, but the simplest ones to think of are hydrogen ions or protons and hydroxyl ions or OH- groups. And so these ions really have a heavy control on not only reduction versus oxidation will occur, but also on the pH of the solution, which obviously, as you can imagine, very heavily controls chemical weathering rates. But this is a video about microbial weathering rather than just abiotic weathering. So let's talk a little bit about microbial colonization and organic reactions. And actually, that's supposed to say microbial, not mineral, so my bad. But microbial colonization on mineral surfaces is really important for weathering rocks and minerals, especially when there's organic reactions going on. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, it's important to note that microbes like bacteria and algae and fungi and lichens all can colonize the surface of rocks, and they do so to gain nutrients. This is because rocks and minerals obviously have a lot of nutrients and minerals that can serve the microorganism and therefore help it to grow and stay living and all that stuff, which everybody likes to do. So the two ways in which they enhance weathering of rocks and minerals are physical and chemical. First, we'll talk about how they can physically penetrate rocks and weather them. So in the case of fungi, they have filaments called hyphae that can penetrate cracks, cleavages, and grain boundaries in the rocks and minerals to gain nutrients. However, minerals that don't have cleavage planes or don't crack easily, like quartz, for example, are much less susceptible to this type of microbial weathering, whereas minerals that have undergone some sort of transition to a secondary phase, like secondary clay phases after feldspar dissolution and weathering, for example, have pore spaces and defects left over in their crystal structure from that process of chemical weathering that they went to get to that secondary phase. And these pore spaces can be exploited by these fungi in the same way we mentioned for cracks, cleavages, and grain boundaries. But bacteria can also play a role in physically weathering rocks. In this case, they actually cover the rock surface in what's called EPS, or extracellular polymeric substances. I've talked about these substances on my channel before. Specifically, I introduced them in the biosorption and cell walls video. I'll link it up here if you want to check it out. but these substances are basically like mucousy type substances that the bacteria can excrete, and in a bacterial colony, they can create biofilm like things that cover rock surfaces or any other surface they want to cover. And this material, EPS, retains water. And this is really important for promoting the weathering of the rock because it promotes not only mineral fracturing, so physical weathering, but also chemical weathering, because the longer they retain the water that's flowing through, say solution is flowing through and around that rock, they can retain that water to prolong the period of time at which that water can interact with the rock's surface and chemically weather it. But EPS can also serve as a substrate for heterotrophs, which can further weather the rocks. I also want to mention that there are even things called endolithic bacteria that actually can grow within natural cavities in rocks, which is pretty freaking awesome. So biological weathering together with abiotic weathering processes like freeze-thaw weathering, where water within the rocks can freeze and then thaw and expand and contract the ice, and thermal expansion and contraction, and wetting and drying processes, all these abiotic processes occurring along with biological processes really break down rocks into tinier fragments and tinier fragments, which become more susceptible to chemical weathering, further breaking down the rocks into tinier and tinier fragments until finally soil can form. And this is when macroorganisms come in, like plants, that can further break down the rocks with their roots and stuff. So all of these processes work together to continue to break down these rocks. So bacteria and fungi, like we talked about with physical weathering, can also chemically dissolve rocks by producing organic acids. And many of these acids are metabolic byproducts, so byproducts of their already metabolism that they're already doing to live and survive. However, some of them are actively excreted when nutrients are limited because they know that they can dissolve the rocks to gain more nutrients. And these acids promote mineral dissolution both directly and indirectly. So let's talk a little bit about how they do this directly. So here we have a mineral and we have organic acids here. Well, these organic acids can release protons that react with the ligands at the surface of the mineral in a process called protonation, and this weakens the bonds at the surface of the mineral. So it kind of loosens out those atoms or molecules right there at that surface of the mineral. And then once loose, the leftover organic anions, so remember this organic acid released a positive charge or proton from itself to leave itself a negative charge, aka now it's an anion, and these leftover organic anions then grab the metal cations that were released from the weakened bonds at the mineral surface and remove them from the mineral surface. This then exposes the underlying oxygen atoms to further protonation from those hydrogen ions being released from the original organic acids. However, these organic acids can also promote mineral dissolution indirectly, like we mentioned. So how does this work? Well, organic acids can complex metals in solution, lowering the solution's saturation state. Now, again, remember, there's also metal cations that are just in solution, dissolved in solution, and when you take up or complex or bind these metal cations, you're decreasing the saturation state of those ions in solution, therefore preventing or decreasing the likelihood that the mineral can form or nucleate from solution because you're just lowering the concentration of the dissolved ions in solution. And it's not only organic acids that can promote mineral dissolution in this way, but other microbial excretions such as siderophores, which I've talked about in the bioabsorption video as well, can bind metal cations in solution as well. And actually these siderophores are excreted by the microbe a little bit more on purpose than a lot of organic acids that are just byproducts. And siderophores actually refer to molecules that are specific to binding iron. So microbes need iron just like all living things like us as well. And some microbial cells can release these molecules to go grab iron and take it back to their cell because they need the iron. However, there are also other blankophores that can be used to grab other metal cations. Siderophores is just the most commonly understood example and commonly employed example by microbes. So now that we know a little bit about how mineral surface reactivity controls the rates of chemical weathering and how microbes can contribute to both physical and chemical weathering, let's talk a little bit about silicate weathering, and then we'll get to carbonate weathering as well as soil formation dissolution and degradation, and then we can get to how things like silicate weathering can really affect climate. So silicate minerals make up 90% of Earth's crust. Let me just repeat that. That is 90% of Earth's crust, guys. So what are silicate minerals exactly? Well, they're minerals that contain silica, or like we saw in the previous slides, silica tetrahedra, which is the framework of these minerals. And then of course, all the different compositional variations cause different minerals within this group to be possible. But the main framework of silicates is silica tetrahedra. And because silicates, specifically due to the silica tetrahedra, undergo incongruent dissolution, remember that that means that different ions are more susceptible to dissolution in the mineral lattice than others. This creates secondary phases when the dissolution or partial dissolution of silicates occurs. So how exactly does this work? Well, silicates that contain calcium, magnesium, potassium, or sodium ions will have those ions plucked and dissolved from their surfaces first, and then variable amounts of aluminum and lastly silicon will be leached out of the mineral lattice, leaving behind metal oxides and clay phases. But the exact type of secondary phase, like we mentioned here, is dependent on three main factors. These factors include whether the composition of the primary mineral is felsic or mafic. So remember, felsic and mafic, which we talk about in basically all of the igneous petrology videos, are basically just terms that differentiate rocks or minerals depending on their silica content. And the two other factors are things like the concentration of the dissolved ions at the mineral surface, as well as conditions like temperature and the amount of water through flow. So let's talk a little bit about how felsic mineral dissolution works, and then we'll talk about how mafic mineral dissolution works. So feldspar, which is a really common felsic mineral, heavily affects the composition of freshwater and secondary minerals in the upper continental crust. And so whatever ions are going to dissolve out of the original primary feldspar phase are going to go into the freshwater that they are dissolving into, and the secondary minerals will be whatever's left over from the feldspar's dissolution. And so the things that affect feldspar dissolution are pH, because protons attack and dissolve the mineral. We talked about how exactly this works with protonation in the organic acids section of the video, and different fluids, so different compositions of solutions and organic acids cause different secondary phases. So it's not only the composition of the primary mineral that affects the secondary phase, but also the composition of the water or solution or acid that's flowing through or being produced maybe by microbes on or at that mineral surface that can affect the secondary phases. But regardless of the solution or acid, what you can generally expect from feldspar dissolution is the release of ions like potassium and aluminum, and the relative stubbornness of silicon in the structure for a while, and you'll be left over with a secondary silicate mineral phase that is more depleted and it's more easily dissolved ions like potassium, aluminum, or calcium or sodium, depending on what was in the feldspar to begin with, and the fresh water that flowed through it will be more enriched in those dissolved ions. But when it comes to mafic minerals, these are not as common in Earth's upper crust and therefore don't as heavily affect the freshwater or secondary phases in Earth's upper crust. However, it's not only that they're not as common, but their weathering also is a little bit different. It involves what's called redox reactions. So we talked about this actually already. We talked about manganese oxides undergoing reductive dissolution. So the manganese was reduced by some sort of electron donor, and this reduction caused the manganese oxides to dissolve. And so this can occur in the reducing direction or the oxidizing direction. And so this is called redox reactions. And actually, for the case of ferromagnesian minerals, like mafic ones, these weather more rapidly in oxic environments. So they undergo oxidation, which dissolves them more easily than reduction would, like we saw with the manganese oxides. So how might bacteria or other microbes actually play a role in this silicate weathering process? Well, they actually have been seen to initiate the dissolution of minerals because of biofilm production at mineral surfaces. And this has been observed to occur more often with mafic minerals because mafic minerals actually contain the bulk of transition metals in the upper crust. Why is that important? Well, transition metals are very important nutrients, and in some some cases limiting nutrients for life and microorganisms and macroorganisms as well. And so to get the transition metals, bacteria try and produce these biofilms on the mafic minerals to gain nutrients from them or the transition metals from them by promoting dissolution of the minerals. So before we get to the exact effect that silicate weathering has on climate and the huge feedback mechanism that it controls, let's talk a little bit about carbonate weathering and organic matter degradation in soil, and then we'll get to that. So carbonate weathering occurs much more easily than silicate weathering does because carbonates are much more reactive and they dissolve congruently, so all at once at the same rate rather than different ions in their structure at different rates. And so they dissolve congruently and at much faster rates and higher pH values than silicates. And carbonate dissolution is really important because not only does it control the flux of calcium ions as well as bicarbonate ions to the hydrosphere, but it also acts as a pH buffer in the ocean and other water bodies. What does this mean? Well, carbonate dissolution may occur when pH becomes lower. You've probably heard of this because ocean acidification due to climate change is occurring, and that's causing the dissolution of carbonate minerals in the ocean. And this carbonate dissolution caused by lowered pH takes up hydrogen ions, which the increase in hydrogen ions in the first place is what caused the lower pH, and therefore kind of stabilizes the pH. Whereas carbonate formation due to an increased pH takes up OH ions, which an increase in OH ions or decrease in protons was the reason for the increased pH in the first place, and therefore lowers the pH back or stabilizes the pH back, kind of stabilizing to where it was, or at least keeping it from going way too high or way too low due to the cycle or formation and dissolution of carbonate minerals. And so these minerals are really, really important to have at Earth's surface within water bodies like the ocean, for example, to combat or at least to minimize the rate at which ocean acidification might occur. But there's a little bit of a caveat because the carbonate minerals that we're counting on to help us to slow the rate of ocean acidification are a lot of times within organisms, because organisms like to build their skeletons and shells and huge coral reefs with carbonate minerals. And so if these things are the things that are dissolving, yes, it's helping chemically to keep the ocean somewhat stable in pH, but it's also killing the organisms that are dissolving to do it. So pros and cons. But carbonate dissolution is not only important for buffering pH in solutions, it also forms the really, really cool features that we know of as caves and karsts. These formations are formed because carbonates dissolve, and this dissolution causes holes within the rock that may become big enough to form caves, which are really, really cool, as you can see in this right picture here with all these stalactites and stalagmites. However, such features have been mostly attributed to abiotic dissolution. So what does it have to do with microbial weathering or microbial dissolution? Well, recent studies have observed biofilms covering and contributing to the dissolution of limestones and dolomites, which might contribute or might have contributed in the past to cave formation in some cases. But moving now to microbial processes in soil. So the main process we'll talk about for soils is OM, or organic matter degradation. Organic matter degradation happens in a sequence in soil, and this sequence starts with the bulk of organic matter being degraded by bacteria and fungi. And this is done by fermentation and respiration by these microorganisms that converts the polysaccharides or carbon sugars in the organic matter in the soil to carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide gets split up. Some of it goes into the atmosphere and some of it reacts with the water within or running through the soil to form carbonic acid. This carbonic acid is another acid, like we talked about earlier, that can promote the dissolution of some of the other minerals in the soil. And after the easily degradable material, like we talked about in this first step, is degraded by those microorganisms and all used up, then cellulose and chitin, some harder to degrade materials, are left over. over, and residual cellulose or chitin may actually remain after prolonged microbial attack. But in general, most of it gets degraded. It just takes a bit longer. And then the last, more complex and most stubborn material like lignin, resin, and waxes remain intact and require much more prolonged microbial attack to actually degrade, and actually can remain intact for as long as thousands of years without becoming degraded. And these stubborn leftover substances that are really hard to degrade are called humic substances. Humic substances can be divided into three main categories: fulvic acids, which are the lightest in color and least stubborn of the humic substances, and humic acid, which is kind of intermediate between the two end members, and then humin, which is the darkest and most stubborn of the humic substances. And why does this matter? Well, humics can play a very critical role in metal cycling, and this is because humic and fulvic acids are organic acids, like we talked about previously, that can deprotonate and bind with the metal cations in solution, indirectly promoting mineral dissolution, or they can directly promote mineral dissolution by lending their protons that they deprotonate off of themselves to attack the surfaces of minerals and therefore loosen the ligands at the surface, like we talked about previously, by protonation. And then the leftover organic anions attack the metal cations that are released from the mineral surface, and so on. And so humics play a really important role in metal cation cycling. So finally, getting to how mineral and rock weathering can affect climate. And we already talked about how carbonate dissolution can buffer the ocean and help slow ocean acidification and how that might affect climate. But silicate weathering, like I mentioned earlier, can also act as a powerful feedback for controlling climate, specifically for controlling atmospheric CO2 levels. How so? Well, the weathering of specifically calcium-containing silicates can allow calcium, like we talked about, which is one of those easier ions to weather than silicon. So if it's calcium-containing, it can allow the calcium to be released more easily from that mineral during dissolution, and the calcium can then sequester carbon to produce carbonates. Carbonate minerals can then accumulate at the seafloor, and these carbonate minerals can then be buried and cycled through the rock cycle, which takes millions of years. So it's a pretty permanent sequesterer of carbon. And because microbes can enhance silicate weathering rates, they can play a critical role in this process, tipping the balance toward more silicate weathering and therefore more carbon burial. Similarly, photosynthesizing organisms can also contribute to carbon sequestration. So this raises a question. If all these organisms are working to enhance carbon sequestration rates, why is global warming due to carbon buildup even a thing right now? Well, for every biological process that sequesters carbon, there's also biological processes that release carbon. Like we talked about in organic matter degradation of soils, that organic matter is something that once took up carbon, like photosynthesizing organisms such as plants, and then as it becomes degraded, that carbon is converted back to carbon dioxide and released back to the atmosphere or into carbonic acids. So this doesn't necessarily represent a very permanent carbon sequestration pathway. Similarly, as we saw in the previous figure, tectonics and volcanism release carbon that was buried in the carbonates back to the atmosphere. And so that, again, is not a fully permanent carbon sequestration pathway, as we can see here. However, it is a much longer term carbon sequestration pathway, and therefore silicate weathering could be a really, really important thing to study in the near future, because yes, planting trees is great, but plants obviously are pretty easily degraded upon their death, and all of that work that they did to sequester carbon while they were living kind of goes undone once they die and are degraded, and the carbon is then released back to the atmosphere. Burial of carbon through this process of silicate weathering and calcium carbon sequestration is really, really important for the more long-term carbon sequestration. And yes, there is an equal and opposite process like volcanism that releases that carbon back into the atmosphere. But if it's possible for us to tip the balance in the favor of more silicate weathering, it might be possible for us to contribute to a negative feedback regarding the current climate trend. And if you want to know more about feedback mechanisms, I talk about those specifically in my climate video, which I'll link up here for you, as well as my Anthropocene video. So negative feedback is good. good. This could be a good negative feedback if you're interested in studying silicate weathering. It's really important right now, and I encourage you all to go into it if you are interested. And that is it for today's video. The upcoming videos include microbial weathering part 2, as well as, I don't even have a thumbnail for it yet, but probably microbial zonation part 1. I'm not sure yet. It's the next chapter in the GEO microbiology book I'm using to make these videos, but it might be that, it might be something else. We'll see. Anyway, speaking of my major reference, I am using GEO Microbiology by Kurt Konhauser. This book is amazing. It's linked down in my description. It's actually not too long a read and it's pretty cheap, so I encourage you guys to go check it out. And other minor and supporting references are also down there in my description if you want to check those out as well. And other than that, if you guys are still watching this video, I applaud you because I think it was a really long one. I can't tell yet because I haven't edited it yet, but I've been talking for a long time, so I'm pretty sure it was really long. So if you're still watching this, comment down below for me what your favorite geobiology or geomicrobiology topic is, and if I haven't covered it yet, maybe I can do so in future videos. So thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!